Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about data quality. So let's get into it. So the question in question was almost identical to the last one. Frederick, would you say that looking after data quality would go a long way in improving the productivity of software developers in a company? Yes and no, because the thing about data quality, which is like it very much comes down to, at least from my perspective, understanding where data quality matters. Because in my opinion, data quality in of itself matters more to the users than to the software developers. It is usually more, depending on how we define it, more concerning to software developers that there's a lack of documentation of the data. That is a much bigger problem for software developers and their productivity than the quality. Let me explain that a little bit. So, data quality, if we define it as, well, usually the issue with data quality is that you have missing records, you have missing data points, or you have things that are, well, like they're being provided in like stale data or something like that. It's something that isn't like frequently updated or so forth and so forth, and sometimes you might not be able to query things in a good way because the architecture is bad or so forth and so forth. All of those sorts of issues come down to a fairly simple problem for the software developer, which is, my problem as a software developer, as the consumer of data, is almost always, all right, do I have everything I need to run my computation, to produce, like, if I'm gonna, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm gonna put something on a screen. Well, if I'm gonna fetch some data from a bunch of systems and I don't have the records, then I can only show an error message to the user. I have no other option. And if there's data, like some pieces of information, it's sort of like, in a sense, I'm not, because software development, guys, it's not just, let's just use this analogy, because it's not usually about mathematics, but if you think of it as a mathematical formula, if I need X, Y, Z, like A, B, C, like these different variables or like these different data points to make some type of equation happen and like produce some end result for my customer, well, if I don't have enough of that, or if I don't have all the variables, then I can't produce something meaningful. So I have to either throw an error, or I have to show a default value or something like that. And that's not really annoying to me as the software developer, because that implementation, I can do that just as if I had the values. It's just coding. It's easy. The problem is that my end user is not going to be very happy with that, which then becomes my problem, or rather, it depends on whose problem it is. But then the data quality becomes the user problem, where they can't actually get the information they want. And now the real problem starts, which is to figure out, okay, how do you fix the data quality? And that, depending on your organization, might become the software developer's problem. It depends, but in many cases I find that that's not much of a problem, because how do you solve data quality if you don't own the system? Like, it's usually, I mean, if the software developers are involved, it's not like they are not responsible for the quality of the data. Usually, they are just responsible for all the logic and like the storage and like all of these sorts of things. But the input and like so forth, it's usually an organizational type of thing, right? Or a manual process somewhere that isn't really working. So a classic one is that you have two different systems, where one system depends on another system's data state of data, and that system is being maintained or being interacted with in a flawed physical process, where like some people work in some part of the company and they don't always update records, or like etc, and that cascades downwards, right? That's a big issue. It's not something you can do so much about as a software developer. But the thing that really slows you down is the lack of documentation of the data, the meaning behind it. In larger organizations or in any company, the number one thing a software developer has to know before they can do anything is, what does this thing mean? If I don't know what the data that I'm using, like, if I'm going to build a feature, if I don't understand the domain or like the problem we're solving or how it works, that's sort of why I tell people that the biggest thing that software developers get that most people do not is that as a software developer, you basically have to be smart enough to understand somebody else's job or the domain of what they do, to the point where you can create an algorithm or like a digital solution to simulate to like a virtual representation of a solution to that problem. That is what your job is. So if you can't figure out how someone else does something or what it actually means, then you can't make progress, because you have to it's sort of like, you know, oh yeah, I need to build a system that calculates I don't know how much dosage someone should get on their medicine, right? Well, to know that, you sort of have to know the formulas. You sort of need to know how the doctor usually prescribes stuff to people and how dosages work and how people usually consume them, etc. You have to sort of understand how that works. And it's the same, I mean, if you think about it, what your job is literally is to take this thing that people usually do by hand, maybe, or like do it manually, and represent that as code somehow. So you have to derive the essence of it. And that is impossible if you don't know what the data means. And that is, I would say, the number one problem. How do you find a domain expert, someone who knows who can explain to you how a lot of the data and like the different information that you're gathering from different systems, what does that actually mean? Because in many cases you find that you get data that is sort of arcane. Like, I mean, an easy thing is like you get a response from an API and it says user ID. Well, you can probably figure out that that's an identifier for a user somewhere in the system. But sometimes you get things that are like product-related information that has a lot of domain language. Like, I mean, especially if it's international. Holy shit, if you ever work with a German API and you're not German, you will know my struggle. Where there's like words in German I have to look up because I have no idea what it means. But then I've looked the word up and I still don't know what the word means. And then I have to ask, like, the people who are like experts in this, like, could you tell me what this tax word actually means and how I fit that into my algorithm? Like, because I'm doing this, and this is where the communication skills is so important, guys. This is a thing that takes a lot of time for the software developer to sort of be educated in, you know, whatever system they're working in. I mean, I just, you know, my thoughts and prayers go out to all my I don't know is what we call them. I'm just saying to the people who work with taxes or the airplane industry or anything like that. You programmers, you are unsung titans, and I can only shudder at the sort of logical pain that you have to go through in terms of figuring out how the domain works in order to do things that are meaningful for your system. Because, I mean, in the job that I have in the automotive industry, struggle to just find someone who can tell me what the different parts of like the car orders and like all that stuff. What does this code even mean? I don't know how to derive this, and there's nothing written down anywhere. I can't just Google for here is this really internal system ID thing for a part in the car. Who do I ask what type of part this is? Because it's just a code. I don't know what it is. That, my friend, that is the thing that takes the longest. And if you document that stuff, if the system owners, that's where ownership comes in, which is the most important thing in a large company usually. You have to have people who understand how to create accessible APIs, who know how to explain how important it is to actually take the time to define and document in a place where you have an easy way to, with the high discoverability, what different things mean in the data. Because if you have a JSON response with a bunch of fields and you don't actually know what the values mean, then you're still stuck. It doesn't matter if the value is there or not because you don't know what it means. So what I want you to take away from this is that, in my opinion, at the very least, data quality is not much of an change. It doesn't affect productivity much for the developer. It definitely has an impact on feature velocity, like how fast can you ship things, because usually data quality creates a situation where the user is very unhappy because many times you don't get the information or the system can't work properly. You can take a fallback strategy there where you sort of like figure out like reasonable defaults, or you might just throw an error or so forth. But for the software developer, it's sort of like, yeah, you can't do much about that. But the thing that really slows you down is when people have like gigantic amounts of domain data that no one really knows what it means, and then the guesswork starts. It's almost like an investigation. You have to go through on a journey of discovery, put on the Indiana Jones hat and figure out what all these hieroglyphics actually mean. And the only way for you to figure it out is either through your own ingenuity or just kind of going out and, hey, does anyone know what this German wording sound actually means? Yeah, I ran it through Translate and I still don't know what it means. That's sort of, I would argue, the biggest blocker. So if we could fix the documentation about what data actually means within our systems, that would help the software developers a lot. Have a great day.